Hey everybody, this is lesson 3 in the skeletal system unit. We're going to cover some skeletal muscle structure today, so let's get right to it. So there's a lot of new terminology in this notes. What we're going to do is sort of break down how a muscle is put together, and there's a lot of different new terminology here. So you're definitely going to want to write all this down and go back to it later because you're definitely not going to get it all on the first go around. So we'll start with the outside of the muscle and sort of work our way in. The outside of the muscle all are covered with something called the epimysium or fascia. And it's a protective layer around the entire muscle. It's relatively thin, it's clear, but it does protect the muscle, especially because most muscles are moving past one another. So there's muscles that are rubbing up against each other. So this epimysium protects those layers so that there's not a problem with those two muscles rubbing up against each other. So then if we move down inside the muscle, you have these groups of muscles, and there's these units that are called fascicles, and we'll get to that. But there's there are these sections, groups of muscle, and you can see them. There are these groups right there, okay, and there's a whole bunch of them here, and so they're called fasciculi, or fascicles, for singular. And they're bundles of muscle fibers, so they're units that you can actually see visually if you were to dissect a muscle, which you can do even when you're looking at a steak or something. Those little the meat strands in there are fascicles that you're seeing. And then you have around each layer, around each fascicle, you have a sheath, a protective layer, and this is called the perimysium. So again, it's a little bit like ogres and onions, that muscles have layers. So we're starting with that outer layer is the epimysium, and then inside that epimysium there's all these fascicles, and each fascicle is covered by a perimysium. Muscle cells within there are called muscle fibers. So they're synonymous with each other, an individual muscle cell or an individual muscle fiber. So one fascicle is often made of dozens of muscle cells or muscle fibers. And then, believe it or not, there are actually a protective layer that surrounds each individual muscle fiber. Muscle fibers are very large cells, so these are cells that are very large, and so they have their own protective layer around there. So you got all the different layers. So if we go back, the 3 different layers, we have the epimysium covering the whole muscle, the perimysium covering the fascicles, and then the endomysium covering each individual muscle fiber. Okay, and so when we get down to the cellular level, what we see is that there is some pretty typical features of cells and then some pretty atypical features. So that has a cell membrane, of course, and that's nothing unique. But what we do see here is that we have some unique features on there. First of all, the cell membrane, and this is true of a lot of things with the muscle cells, they have their own name. The membrane for a muscle cell is called the sarcolemma. So the sarcolemma there's nothing special about it that makes it different than any other cell membrane. It just gets its own name because everything in a muscle cell has its own name. It also has nuclei, so that is a little bit unique in that this cell is a multinucleated cell. Sometimes dozens and dozens of nuclei. There's such large cells that they need these extra things. And the other unique thing about the nuclei is they're off to the side. They're not in the middle. And then we have this other part of it called the T-tubules. Okay, the T-tubules are actually sort of inversions of the cell membrane that actually run into the cell. So there's basically allowing the cell membrane and stuff from the outside to actually get in and run around these tubes. And they're at regular intervals along the cell. So those are key, and we'll get to it later, but that's important in when you are signaling the muscle cell to contract. You want the entire muscle cell to contract simultaneously. The transverse tubules or T-tubules allow that message to get to the anterior and get to all these functional units at the same time. So T-tubules connect to sarcolemma, which is, again, the cell membrane, and it also it attaches it to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Again, another fancy name for something that you already know. You know that cells have an endoplasmic reticulum. So in a muscle cell, the endoplasmic reticulum gets a specialized name, and it looks a little bit different than most typical cells, but we call it the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Sarcoplasmic reticulum is important in storing calcium. Calcium is the key ingredient to make a muscle contract. So when the calcium is stored inside that sarcoplasmic reticulum there, the muscle is relaxed. As soon as that sarcoplasmic reticulum is triggered to release the calcium, then all of these little contractile units contract all at once. So that is the key feature, that calcium is the key ingredient. And we'll get more into that in a little bit later. So the sarcoplasm is another name for the cytoplasm of the cell. Nothing particularly unique about it. The other thing you'll see, and again, we don't mention this in the notes, but you'll see a ton of mitochondria in the cells. Again, that's kind of obvious because the mitochondria you need that to make the ATP, and you need lots of ATP to make the muscles work. And then within each muscle cell, you have these things called myofibrils, and the number of myofibrils in each cell varies, but the number of myofibrils is proportional to the strength of that muscle. So the bigger the muscle, the stronger it needs to be, the more myofibrils you need. And these are thread-like structures that extend from one end of the cell all the way to the other, and they're the contractile unit, and they're primarily made of two proteins. Those proteins are actin and myosin. Actin and myosin are two of the most common proteins. In fact, actin is the most common, and I think myosin is third, maybe second or third or fourth on the list of the most common proteins in your body. So these proteins are incredibly important. It's why when you are trying to build muscle, when you're trying to lift weights and get stronger, you need a high protein diet so that you can produce more actin, because your muscles can't get bigger unless you produce more protein and get more actin and myosin in the muscle cells. So in this diagram, we show this is the sarcomere. So this is this individual unit. And we'll get to that. That individual unit is the smallest unit that actually works in a muscle, and there's millions of them tied together that make a muscle work. But individually, a sarcomere can get shorter. So what we'll see is that these two fibers, there's one called the actin. Okay, here it's designated by this little purple, and it really looks like a string of pearls, but it's actually two of them curled around each other. It's a pretty basic protein, and like I said, very common. And then you also have the myosin, which is a little bit more complicated, and we'll get into that. But the myosin is often referred to as the thick filament, and it obviously is broader. It's a bigger protein, and it has some unique features, and you can't really tell very well here, but it's actually got some features on the end of the myosin units that are really important into its function. And so we have these repeating units called sarcomeres, okay? And essentially how you put the actin and myosin together is what makes the muscle work entirely. So the sarcomere is up here, it's from this little blue line to this little blue line. And down here, we see it from here to here is the one sarcomere. So there's actually two sarcomeres shown here. And what you can see is that the purple fibers, or the actin, they basically don't do anything except provide strength. So you can essentially pull on them. They're little tug ropes. And then you have the myosin, which is stuck in between. And the myosin fibers actually have the ability to pull. They have these little, we'll call them nubs at the end. And those nubs are able to pull the actin. So what you can see here is that the myosin is going to pull on the actin. It's going to pull this actin fiber going to the left and this actin fiber going to the right, and what it in fact does is it shortens this entire thing. We're going to have lots more on this, so if you didn't understand that explanation, don't worry about it right now. We're going to have some more on this, but it's that arrangement, that sort of crossing over between the actin and myosin that actually allows the whole muscle to shorten itself and become shorter, which is what gives it ability to move you. You know, everything is done by taking 2 points on your body and making that distance shorter. That's what's going on in basically every muscle movement that you can possibly do. So there's more to come on this, and we will get into how exactly this sarcomere works. It is going to get a little technical, but we'll do our best to show you some videos and show you some things that are going to help out. Thanks a lot.